I've always thought that Oxford reveals its truths most reluctantly at dusk, when the day's youthful haste drains away and the stones regain their authority. That evening, beneath Tom Tower, I felt the air settle around me with the kind of solemn indifference only ancient buildings can afford. Students drifted past in muted pairs, shadows cutting quick diagonals through the pale wash of the street lamps. Great Tom murmured somewhere above, its deep, familiar note carrying a faint tremor across the cobblestones as though the tower exhaled. I remember pausing for no particular reason other than the sense rational, perhaps that something had been shifted beneath the usual rhythms. A scent lingered in the damp air, barely perceptible parchment, or something near enough to it. Old paper never fully releases its secrets. It simply waits for the right hand to disturb it. The odd trace carried down from the steps, and I found myself halting in that uncertain way one does when instinct tries to speak before reason can justify it. Lewis was late, though I cannot say I minded. A few stray raindrops had begun their tentative descent. Oxford rain rarely arrives dramatically. It prefers a quiet insistence that mirrors the city's temperament. I leaned against the cold stone, letting my thoughts drift or perhaps spiral, as they too often did toward a recent crossword. The clue had read, "Earth hides what memory fears." I hadn't solved it then. I'm not sure I've solved it even now. A rustle at my feet broke the reverie. A student newspaper lay abandoned on the steps, its corner caught in a draft that made it flutter like a weak pulse. I stooped, partly out of habit, partly because even forgotten papers in Oxford have been known to reveal more than intended. The headline was banal, a minor political story, some petty squabble over funding. But at the bottom of the page, tucked in the announcements as though deliberately swallowing a small notice, it reported the death of Charles Henley, a retired archivist once attached to one of the more discreet corners of the university's labyrinthine records. Found dead at home after a fall, the announcement said, and the phrasing struck me immediately with its careful understatement. Institutions can be admirably efficient when it comes to tidying away their own embarrassments. Henley's name stirred the faintest recollection, the sort that brushes against the mind like a cold sleeve in a crowded hallway. Lewis finally appeared, his expression equal parts apology and mild exasperation. "Traffic," he muttered. I told him he had missed nothing except a brief communion with Oxford's melancholia. He gave me the look he reserves for my less practical observations. He asked whether I meant to stand out in the rain for the rest of the night. I said the rain suited me fine. The city feels honest when wet, stripped of its pretensions. As we walked, I mentioned Henley's death in the same tone one might use to remark upon a misfiled book. Lewis shrugged, saying falls happen to older men more often than anyone likes to admit. But I found myself returning to the phrasing after a fall. It was the kind of neat, effortless explanation that begs to be accepted. And perhaps that was what unsettled me. That ease, that tidiness. Henley, if memory serves, had spent the latter half of his career in the sealed archives beneath Tom Tower, where the university stores the remnants of lives it can't quite discard yet cannot bear to display. The scent returned to me then, that faint suggestion of parchment. Not the fresh sheets of a modern office, but the older, brittle kind that carries the residue of hands long gone. I couldn't have explained why it mattered, not then. But experience has taught me that the smallest inconsistencies often cling to the truth long after larger deceptions have faded. Lewis asked what I was thinking. I told him nothing of consequence. There is little to be gained by voicing such impressions prematurely. They vanish the moment they are subjected to scrutiny. Better to let them rest and see whether they choose to rise again. We parted near the lodge. Great Tom sounded once more, slow and resonant, and I felt the weight of the tower settle into my bones. It occurred to me that Henley's life, and whatever had led to its quiet conclusion, might lie somewhere beneath those steps, waiting as Oxford so often waits for someone foolish enough to dig. And I, as usual, was already listening for the first crack in the silence. I went to see the porter the following morning, though morning is perhaps the wrong word for that grey stretch of time when Oxford seems half-formed and reluctant to wake. The sky had the colour of rubbed slate, and the quadrangle lay in the sort of silence that always makes me uneasy, too clean, too expectant. I have never trusted a quiet college. There is always something moving beneath the hush. The porter, a man called Redway, had the scrubbed, faintly glazed look of someone who has learned the art of saying precisely what is required, and no more. He greeted me with the respect afforded to my position, though beneath it I sensed a thin glaze of calculation. People forget that silence can be a performance. Redway's was immaculate. I asked him about Henley's last visit to the archives. He replied that the old man had come by a week before his death. For what purpose, he didn't know. But the phrasing struck me. For what purpose, he didn't know. Spoken too evenly, like a line rehearsed. There was no hesitation, no searching for memory, as though he had practiced the answer in advance. I've learned to pay attention when people sound too prepared. Oxford trains clever liars. Redway produced the visitor logbook with the solemnity of a priest offering scripture. The book smelled faintly of dust and ink-old ink, the kind that sinks into paper like a regret. I turned the pages slowly, letting my eyes drift across, lines filled with students, professors, librarians, and the occasional curious genealogist. Then I found Henley's name. It sat properly in its place, neat and unobtrusive, as though he had always been a man who moved quietly through lists. What caught me wasn't Henley's entry, but the one beneath. A name had been scribbled out with an unusual ferocity, several strokes of a heavy hand, the impressions pressed so deeply the page beneath bore the ghost of them. Whoever had tried to erase the name wanted very much for it to disappear. And in my experience, such efforts usually imply the opposite, that the name is the one to remember. I asked Redway what had been written there. He answered too quickly. "A student error," he said. "Someone signed in by mistake." My instinct bristled. A porter knows every regular visitor, every interloper, every rustle of trouble in the corridors. Redway, pretending ignorance, felt like a violin played just slightly off-pitch. One misaligned note, but enough to disturb the air. Lewis arrived then, late again, though carrying a coffee as if to apologize in advance. He asked what I'd found. I told him a name removed with such enthusiasm that it could hardly be meaningless. He looked unconvinced but kept his counsel. Lewis has always given me the courtesy of letting my hunches breathe, even when they seem absurd. I sometimes suspect he finds a certain fondness in my absurdities. Redway attempted to direct our attention elsewhere by mentioning Henley's temperament. "A quiet man," he said. "No trouble. Kept to himself. That sort." The phrase "that sort" lingered in the air with the faintest curl of disdain. People rarely use those words for someone they truly understand. Before leaving, I lifted the logbook again. Something about the handwriting beneath the scratched-out name caught my eye. A slight slant, leftward, uncommon. A detail, nothing more. But details are the threads that eventually tug open the whole garment. Outside, the rain had gathered into a steadier fall, pattering against the worn stone steps with a rhythm that felt almost contemplative. Lewis asked why I cared so much about a man whose death everyone seemed ready to file away as inevitable. I told him it was the filing that bothered me. Things placed too neatly always conceal a certain effort. And Henley, by all accounts, had been a man of precise habits. People who keep perfect order do not simply fall. They are pushed sometimes literally, sometimes by circumstance, sometimes by the weight of a past that refuses to stay tucked inside its folder. As we walked toward the gate, I thought again of the crossword clue that had eluded me the night before. Earth hides what memory fears. It hovered at the edge of understanding, just out of reach, like a whisper behind a closed door. In retrospect, it was absurdly obvious, but at the time all I felt was the faint pressure of something shifting beneath the surface, something small, something buried, something waiting to be unearthed. I have never trusted houses that smell faintly of lavender. It is a scent people choose when they want the illusion of calm, the performance of serenity. Henley's niece lived in such a house, its narrow windows half-veiled by curtains that admitted only a timid light, as though the day itself felt unwelcome. When she opened the door, I was struck not by sorrow, but by an immaculate composure that bordered on defiance. She introduced herself in a voice so carefully modulated it left no room for sympathy. She led me through a corridor lined with books, serious texts, most of them, and all placed with a precision that suggested either deep affection or deep fear of disorder. Somewhere in the distance a floorboard creaked, not from age but from attention the house seemed to listen. She motioned me into a small study, insisting she preferred to stand. People who refuse chairs often refuse vulnerability as well. She spoke of her uncle with an academic detachment that would have troubled me less had it been grief rather than indifference she was holding back. She said he had always been a man inclined toward accidents. I asked whether she believed his fall was truly accidental. She paused not long, not theatrically, but in a way that suggested she was deciding how much of herself she wished to reveal. She replied that inevitability was a kind of mercy for certain men. The phrasing flicked a quiet spark of unease at the edges of my mind. My eyes drifted to the desk beside her. A half-written letter lay open, the ink slightly smudged. A quotation sat in the center like an ornament. Shelley, though she had placed the date incorrectly by several years. It was the sort of slip no scholar of medieval literature should have made, and yet she had. Careless error or deliberately corrupt detail. I have learned that incorrect facts sometimes shield uncomfortable truths. She caught me glancing at the letter and shifted her stance as though blocking an unseen draft. She spoke then of a sealed dossier from the 1970s that had disturbed her uncle in recent months. Something about protest movements, disciplinary hearings, the tangling of private indiscretions with public ideals. She dismissed its importance with admirable elegance, which of course made it all the more important. The most telling lies are those told with a light hand. Lewis, standing behind me, asked gently if Henley had been agitated during his final days. The question seemed to irritate her in a way she attempted and failed to disguise. She said agitation was not uncommon among elderly men who had spent too long in archives. Dust weakens certain minds. It was then that I noticed her fingers moving rhythmically against her thumb, a small, repetitive pressure, the unconscious gesture of someone masking tension they refused to name. On the mantelpiece stood a photograph of Henley in younger years, flanked by two academics I vaguely recognized, and a third figure whose face had been cropped just at the edge. The trimming was subtle but unmistakably precise. I asked about it. She answered that the original frame had been damaged. Her tone suggested the matter was closed, yet there lingered a faint tremor in her voice that did not match the explanation. A discrepancy, small but persistent, like a note struck slightly off-key. She offered us tea but did not wait for an answer, already moving toward the kitchen with a certainty that felt almost rehearsed. Lewis whispered a question, something about whether I believed her. I murmured that belief was a luxury in short supply. I found myself studying the study once more, the books arranged too symmetrically, the air too still. A house that hides nothing rarely feels that tidy. When she returned, she carried the tray with both hands, though one would have sufficed. A gesture of control, perhaps, or of caution. I asked whether her uncle had ever spoken of regrets. She said he had been a man who preferred silence to confession. Then, with an almost imperceptible hesitation, she added that he had been restless the week before his fall. Restless in a way she could not quite describe. She was not a woman prone to vague impressions, which made the vagueness significant. As we prepared to leave, she asked whether I expected to find something her uncle had hidden. I told her, I rarely expect anything. I merely follow the faintest discrepancies until they begin to align. She smiled then, not warmly, but with the brittle amusement of someone accustomed to intellectual games. She said that Oxford breeds men who search for secrets where none exist. I replied that Oxford also buries secrets where no one thinks to look. Outside, the light had shifted toward evening, and a breeze carried the scent of rain across the lane. Lewis asked what I had noticed. I told him only that she had grieved too neatly, if at all. People who care deeply often struggle to shape their sorrow into order. Her order had been flawless, painfully, suspiciously flawless. And as we walked away, I found myself thinking of the misdated quote, hovering like a faint handprint on the surface of an old manuscript. A small error, yes. But small errors, in my experience, are rarely accidental. I arranged to meet the three men on the same afternoon, though not all at once. Oxford has a way of revealing truth only through contrast, and I preferred to hear each version before they had the opportunity to align their stories. The first was a political theorist of some former renown, now weathered into a brittle sort of gentility. His studies smelled of old cigars and the faint, sour ghost of arguments long concluded. He spoke of Henley with a dismissiveness that felt too carefully measured. A competent archivist, he said. Nothing more, and certainly nothing that could warrant the kind of dramatic attention I was evidently giving his death. Yet as he spoke, his hand drifted repeatedly toward a locked drawer of the desk, not to open it, but to ensure it remained closed. A small gesture, easily missed, but not by me. I asked whether he had seen Henley recently. A pause. Only briefly, he said. Weeks ago. But the pause was not the hesitation of memory. It was the pause of a man deciding how much truth might incriminate him. The second man received Lewis and me in a room that resembled a mausoleum dressed as a library. Shelves lined with classical texts watched us like spectators at a quiet trial. This was the classic Donslender, delicately mannered, every phrase delivered with the weary elegance of someone performing intellectual sorrow. He said Henley had been distant, even aloof. Hardly surprising, he added, given the man's temperament. I asked about the dossier, though I did not specify which one. He reacted with a flicker of annoyance, too swift, too revealing. He answered that academic rumors were as common as dust and deserved the same amount of attention. But as he moved to retrieve a book from a shelf, I noticed his fingers tremble imperceptibly. Not age, not fear, something subtler, a memory he would rather not disturb. Lewis caught my eye, and I sensed he had seen it too, though he said nothing. We have developed a habit of quiet comprehension, Lewis and I, a form of dialogue without words. The administrator was the last, and I expected little from him. Yet his office unsettled me more than the others. It was painfully tidy, the sort of tidiness that hints at a life spent smoothing over unpleasant truths. He welcomed us with excessive politeness, offering tea he didn't appear to drink himself. He said Henley had been a fine servant of the college, a man who carried out his duties with diligence and discretion. The words hung in the air with a sweetness that felt artificially applied. I asked directly whether Henley had ever voiced concerns about documents from the past. He hesitated, but only for half a breath, then said no, certainly not, though one could never fully predict the anxieties of elderly men. His tone was gentle, but the phrasing bothered me. The anxieties of elderly men, too general, too dismissive. Language betrayed him the way a loose thread betrays an otherwise perfect garment. A moment later, he mentioned offhandedly that he had once overseen the archives in his early academic years, long before Henley's tenure. The comment came lightly, but its placement was odd, as though inserted to appear harmless. I found myself wondering why he had chosen to volunteer at all. Lewis folded his arms and asked whether any documents had ever required special handling. The administrator smiled at that, an unconvincing smile that flickered and died before it reached his eyes. He said the college had no secrets worth burying. The word struck me as both too polished and too hopeful. Only institutions with buried secrets ever feel the need to express such certainty. We left the office with nothing that resembled evidence, and yet everything that resembled motive. Each man had offered a version of Henley that suited his own interests. Each had denied knowledge of the dossier, and yet in denying it, they had revealed more than they intended. There is something about a lie told elegantly. It casts a soft glow around the truth it tries to obscure. As we crossed the quad, Lewis asked which of the three I believed. None of them, I replied. Or rather, all of them, each in small, suspicious increments. The political theorist had feared exposure of some argument buried in a past he preferred to forget. The classic's Don had trembled at the mention of protest years, as though hearing an old melody played off-key, and the administrator had spoken with a solicitude that felt like the outer shell of a very delicate panic. Nothing was proven. Nothing was clear. And yet I could feel the weight of the dossier in the air around us, something old, something quietly dangerous, something that had slipped from the safety of its hiding place. The rain began again, soft and persistent, tapping against the stones like fingers against a locked door. Lewis asked what we should do next. I told him we would not chase answers. We would wait for the inconsistencies to breathe. In Oxford, truths buried deeply do not stay buried for long. They rise the moment someone notices the smallest misfiled detail. The photograph reached me not through official channels, but folded into an envelope that had been slipped beneath my office door, as though its bearer lacked either the courage or the permission to hand it to me directly. I recognized the texture of the paper before I unfolded it, the faintly waxed finish common to college archives in the 1970s. And when I opened it fully, the air seemed to tighten around the room with a hush that felt almost reverent. 4 figures stood shoulder to shoulder in the image, their expressions caught in that strange limbo between idealism and apprehension that marked student protests of the era. 3 faces were clear enough. The political theorist, dark-haired and arrogant in youth, the classic's Don, thin and evasive even then, and a woman whose expression betrayed neither defiance nor fear, but a kind of watchful restraint. The 4th figure, however, was another matter. His or perhaps her face had been removed with a precision that felt almost surgical, not torn in anger, cut away deliberately. I found myself staring at the empty space longer than I intended, as though the absence carried more weight than the remaining faces. A single clue remained: the sliver of a shoulder clothed in a patterned fabric I couldn't quite place. Something about the pattern felt familiar, but familiarity isn't proof. It's merely a suggestion, and suggestion is a dangerous companion. Lewis arrived a moment later, carrying 2 coffees and frowning at the photograph as if it had insulted him personally. He asked who had sent it. I told him I hadn't the faintest idea. Anonymous benefactors rarely announce themselves. He asked what I made of the missing face. I answered that what is removed deliberately often matters more than what is left behind. He did not disagree. We returned to Henley's house, where the niece greeted us with a composure that struck me as even more brittle than before. I held the photograph out to her, and for the first time since meeting her, she faltered. Only for a heartbeat, but I saw the hesitation ripple across her features like a shadow passing over still water. She said she had never seen the image. I doubted her, though doubt is a quiet thing, not a declaration. Her gaze drifted toward the mantelpiece, where the framed photograph I had noticed previously still rested, This time I studied it more carefully. The trimming had been executed with almost identical precision to the one before me, so precise, in fact, that I felt a small shift of certainty begin to take shape. I asked why the frame had been altered. She said it had been damaged, the same excuse as before, but her voice betrayed a mild tremor that caught at the edge of the syllables. And then her hand moved to her collarbone, a small, unconscious gesture, drawing attention to a pendant I had not properly observed on my previous visit. A silver charm with an engraved pattern, subtle, intricate, and unmistakably similar to the fabric on the shoulder of the missing figure in the photograph. Not identical, but kind enough to stir something in the mind. I wondered whether she realized she had revealed more in that brief touch than in all her spoken words combined. Lewis asked if there had been any dispute between Henley and the people in the photo. She answered too quickly, too neatly, that she knew nothing of her uncle's associations from that era. But her eyes slid away from mine, not in guilt, but in calculation. She was deciding which lie would be the least costly. A bookshelf creaked behind her, a quiet sound, but enough to disrupt the silence. I've learned that disturbed air often signals a disturbed conscience. I asked whether her uncle had ever mentioned the protests of '72. She said no. The answer was immediate, but too well prepared. People rarely rehearse the truth. Before leaving, I allowed myself one final glance around the study. The room was painfully tidy, the kind of tidiness that suggests a recent, frantic attempt to arrange chaos into order. A stack of letters sat bound with a ribbon, but the top envelope carried a faint indentation, as though someone had pressed their thumb into it in frustration or hesitation. A minor detail, but nothing in Henley's world had been minor. Outside, the rain had eased, leaving the lane damp and reflective. Lewis asked what I believed. I told him I believed the missing face mattered and that people rarely remove themselves from photographs unless they fear being remembered. He asked whether I suspected the niece. I said suspicion was a blunt tool. What I needed was the right question. As we walked away, I felt the faint pressure of the puzzle settling around the torn face. The pendant, the lies shaped too elegantly, the histories wrapped too tightly in lavender and composure. Something had been excised, not out of anger, but out of fear. And fear, when concealed with such precision, always leads somewhere worth following. The photograph, for all its missing pieces, felt less like evidence than invitation. There are moments in an investigation when the pieces align so neatly that the mind, weary from uncertainty, feels an almost guilty relief. I remember that afternoon with uncomfortable clarity, the light thinning over the rooftops, the air tasting faintly of mist, Lewis shifting beside me with that hopeful expectancy he rarely displays unless he thinks we are near the truth. And for a brief, treacherous moment, I allowed myself to imagine that we were. The theory settled itself with such fluid grace that even I felt its pull. Henley's niece, precise, controlled, too elegant in her evasions, had motives that glittered like glass shards when held to the light. The photograph with the missing face, the pendant matching the pattern, the misdated Shelley quotation, the trimmed frame, the restless talk of a dossier tied to old protests and older indiscretions, all gathered into a shape so symmetrical it almost pleased me. Lewis said, in that tentative way of his, that perhaps she had been trying to protect what remained of her family's dignity. "People do foolish things for blood," he murmured. I agreed, though agreement felt suspiciously easy. She had both proximity and poise, the combination that so often hides guilt in Oxford. A woman capable of intellectual neatness is often capable of other kinds of neatness too. I could almost see her arranging her uncle's death as one arranges a shelf quietly, methodically, without a ripple of disarray. Yet certainty in police work is like a violin string drawn too tight. It betrays itself with a false note. We returned to the college archives to test the theory. The corridor leading there was dim, lit only by the watery glow of a single overhead bulb that flickered as though uncertain of its own endurance. The air felt chalky with disuse, as though the archives had been holding their breath for decades. The logbook still lay where Redway had left it, open as if expecting confession. Lewis flipped to Henley's entry again. Everything about the page appeared to support our conclusion. The scratched name beneath hers, we reasoned, was an attempt to erase her presence from a place she had no right to be that night. The timing matched. The motive made sense. The pattern on the missing figure's shoulder aligned with her pendant so neatly it felt like destiny. Too neatly. I've always disliked perfection. It carries the faint odor of manipulation. Lewis asked what troubled me. I told him I had no objection to the narrative. It was simply that narratives, especially the elegant ones, often conceal their own misdirections. I found myself studying the scratched-out name again, tracing the indentation of the strokes with my finger. A curious thing. The pressure of the lines was inconsistent, heavier toward the end, as though the writer had grown increasingly uncertain rather than increasingly angry. Anger produces decisive motion. Uncertainty produces this to and fro hesitation, the way a child might erase, rewrite, and erase again. I said to Lewis that the niece did not strike me as a woman who ever hesitated. We visited her once more, though I did not announce my true purpose. She seemed almost relieved to see us, in that brittle way people sometimes welcome scrutiny when they believe themselves wrongly suspected. She offered tea again, and the ritual amused me. People cling to ceremonies when they fear collapse. I asked about the photograph, pressing her gently at first, then with sharper intent. Her answers were steady, too steady, each polished like a stone she had carried in her pocket for years. Lewis believed her. I did not, but even disbelief has its limitations. Standing in her quiet study, the house breathing its lavender-scented composure around us, I found myself tempted to give in to the simplicity of the theory. All roads lead here, Lewis murmured. And he was right. Every small clue had curled inward toward her like vines, seeking the same support. That was precisely the problem. Clues rarely curl so cooperatively. They resist arrangement. They clumsily contradict, misbehave, refuse to tidy themselves into one convenient hand. And yet these had lined up with suspicious obedience, as though guided by an unseen hand. On my way out, I paused by the bookshelf again. One volume sat slightly misaligned among its rigid neighbors, not enough to catch the eye unless one was already suspicious. I slid it out. Dust clung too lightly to its spine, as though it had been handled recently. Inside lay nothing but a small crease on the first blank page, an indentation suggesting that something had once been pressed there and later removed. A detail, a whisper, nothing conclusive, and yet I felt the false solution crumble in my hands like old plaster. Back outside, the evening air had cooled, carrying the faint metallic scent of oncoming rain. Lewis asked why I seemed unsettled. I told him that the theory fit too well. Stories that fit too well often hide the wrong storyteller. He frowned, not following. I understood his confusion and doubt as a lonely companion. As we walked toward the car, I felt the case settling into a new shape, a quieter, more uncomfortable one. The niece might still be guilty, or she might merely be the convenient shadow someone else used to direct our gaze away from their own. A false solution is a dangerous comfort, and comfort, in Oxford, is a luxury rarely offered without consequence. It was Lewis who first suggested we return to the base of Tom Tower, though he framed it as a casual remark, as if the notion had drifted lightly through his mind rather than pressed insistently against it. I pretended not to notice the flicker of eagerness in his voice. By then, both of us felt the slow tightening of the case, the way Oxford sometimes draws its secrets inward like a lung preparing for a final held breath. If Henley had left something behind, something he feared others would find. It would not have been in any place touched by sunlight. The evening carried the heavy stillness that descends upon the city just before night fully commits itself. We walked in silence past the gate, the echo of our steps landing with an oddly solemn rhythm on the damp stones. The door to the service passage beneath Tom Tower had always looked unassuming, an afterthought in the architecture. Yet that night it seemed to watch us with the same quiet scrutiny the colleges often reserve for their own misdeeds. The porter had reluctantly given us the key. His reluctance was telling, not loud, not theatrical, but the sort of measured resistance that signals a deeper unease. People rarely fear dark rooms. They fear what memory refuses to leave in them. Inside, the air was colder than I expected, as though the stones themselves hoarded chill. The passage smelled of chalk, disuse, and the faintly metallic scent of old pipes. Lewis shone his torch ahead, and the thin beam quivered on the curved walls, revealing cobwebs thick enough to seem deliberate. As we walked, I felt the familiar sensation of being observed not by a person, but by the weight of history, the way centuries accumulate in corners and watch you with mute appraisal. We reached the shallow recess near the outer steps, a place I'd passed a dozen times but never truly seen. It bore the unmistakable scuff marks of recent disturbance. Dust had been brushed aside in a rough semicircle. A stone at the base sat slightly askew, as if someone had lifted it and forgotten how precisely it had once rested. Lewis crouched first. He murmured something about the stone feeling lighter than expected. I knelt beside him, and together we shifted it, the scrape echoing through the passage with a mournful, hollow sound. Beneath lay a narrow cavity lined with fragments of old mortar and something metallic that glinted with reluctant recognition. A box. Nothing ornate, no romantic patina, of age just a plain, battered metal container large enough to hold documents and small enough to hide with hurried hands. I lifted it, feeling its weight and the faint vibration of my own pulse against the cold surface. Lewis asked whether I wanted to open it there. I said no. Some things demand the dignity of air and silence. Outside, beneath the dim orange glow of the nearest lamp, I pried it open. The hinges protested with a tired sigh. Inside lay a scatter of papers that had been disturbed, perhaps rifled through by Henley in his final days. The top page bore the faint outline of a college crest, half faded by time. Beneath it, pages had been torn out, entire sections missing, as if someone had removed names or confessions or indictments not yet ready to resurface. Lewis leaned closer. He whispered that the papers hinted at disciplinary hearings from the early 1970s, the kind that rarely reached daylight unless dragged out by force. Some names were smudged, some signatures half obscured, and the final page, the crucial one, had been torn so cleanly it felt sinister in its precision. But what caught my eye was a small corner of parchment tucked between two folded sheets. A poem, or perhaps a fragment of one, written in Henley's hand. A few uneven lines, the ink pooling slightly in places. Earth keeps the things we dare not name, but stone remembers every footfall. It felt like a message, though its meaning eluded me then. A breadcrumb from a man who had spent his life cataloguing the secrets of others. Lewis asked whether the niece could have known of the box. I told him it was possible, but not certain. The fingers that had torn the final page had pressed harder than hers ever would. The indentations bore the weight of someone stronger, or perhaps more desperate. A gust of wind curled around the tower then, carrying the scent of wet stone, a scent I've always associated with things long buried and recently disturbed. I closed the box slowly, as though reluctant to trap its silence again. We stood beneath Tom Tower, listening to the murmur of the city settling into night. I felt a faint shift within the case's architecture, a subtle rebalancing of suspicion. The false solution had dissolved. Something older, darker, and far less orderly was beginning to emerge. Lewis asked what our next step would be. I told him we were no longer following clues. We were following ghosts, the kind that leave paper trails, not footprints. Oxford, for all its grandeur, has never known what to do with its own forgotten sins. And beneath the stones, Henley had placed his last attempt at truth. It has always intrigued me how suspicion, once stirred, moves from person to person with the fluidity of candle smoke clinging for a moment, then drifting on. The three academics had lingered at the edges of my thoughts since the beginning, each carrying just enough unease to merit attention, but never enough to anchor certainty. After finding the metal box beneath the stones, Lewis suggested we revisit them. I agreed, though my reasons were not the same as his. He hoped for confession, and I hoped for contradiction. We began with the classic's Don, whose study appeared even more sepulchral than before. The curtains were half-drawn, though the afternoon sun would have offered him a gentler light than the lamps he insisted on using. He welcomed us with a nervous civility, as though anticipating a question he had practiced answering. I watched his hands twitch intermittently, restless in a way that suggested an argument rehearsed too often. I asked whether he recalled the protests of '72. He answered, in a tone meant to convey weariness with the past. Youthful fervor, misplaced passions, idealism best forgotten. Yet he quoted a Latin phrase slightly misquoted, but close enough to reveal familiarity rather than dismissal. The detail lodged itself in my mind like a stray note in a symphony imperfect, yet unmistakably part of the original score. Lewis shot me a glance, but said nothing. We moved on to the political theorist, whose room smelled strongly of varnish, as though he had attempted to mask another scent. He leaned heavily on the desk, speaking with an affected nonchalance that fooled neither of us. He claimed the entire dossier was a fabrication rumor wrapped in nostalgia, nothing more. But as he spoke, he tapped his index finger against the table in a pattern too steady to be unconscious. 4 taps, pause, 3 taps. A scholar of systems might not realize he was revealing his own. It was a detail, small but telling not guilt, perhaps, but anxiety. He mentioned Henley only once, referring to him as a harmless recorder of irrelevant minutiae. Yet when I asked whether Henley had recently contacted him, he blinked too slowly, as though forcing his eyes not to betray him. No, he said. But denial delivered with such heaviness rarely convinces. The administrator was our final visit. His office felt oppressively tidy, as if order had been weaponized. He greeted us with exaggerated warmth, the overt politeness that often masks dread. He said he was pleased to assist in any way, though the pallor beneath his composure suggested otherwise. Lewis asked directly whether he had ever handled the sealed dossier. The administrator smiled, a brittle, almost fragile thing, and replied that archival matters had never truly been his domain. But his gaze drifted momentarily to a cabinet in the corner, its lock recently oiled, judging by the faint sheen around the keyhole. I noticed his shoes were dusted with a thin, gray residue. Stone dust. The same that clung to our clothes after visiting the service passage. He saw me notice, though he pretended not to. His fingers tightened around the edge of the desk, as though bracing for an unspoken accusation. Yet when I said nothing, he relaxed too quickly, like a man relieved to delay a confession he was not yet ready to make. Lewis whispered as we walked down the staircase that the administrator was hiding something. I replied that all three were hiding something, though not necessarily the same thing. Their lies fit together too neatly, overlapping just enough to point in a direction that felt prepared rather than accidental. They were not coordinating their stories, they were coordinating their fears. A red herring, after all, does not announce itself. It merely glistens in the right light. As we stepped back into the quadrangle, rain began again. soft but insistent. Students hurried past us, shielding books beneath coats. The college bell tolled once low and resonant, and I felt its vibration settle into the case like a punctuation mark. The air tasted of damp leaves and something else, the faint, metallic tang of misdirection. Lewis asked whether I believed any of them capable of murder. I said capability was rarely the question. Motive, opportunity, fear, these were more reliable companions. But fear, especially, has a way of rewriting histories, and in these men, fear had etched itself subtly into their gestures, their pauses, their misremembered lines. The real question, I told him, was not who might have killed Henley. It was who had the most to lose if the dossier resurfaced. And that answer, though not yet clear, did not lie among red herrings. As we walked away, the rain softened further, settling into a hush that felt almost apologetic. Oxford often whispers its warnings, never shouts them, and the whispers, when finally heard, tend to lead not toward culprits, but toward the quiet places where truth hides, waiting not for justice, but for recognition. And somewhere in that hush, I sensed that the second red herring had just finished its performance. There is a particular kind of weariness that arrives deep into an investigation, when suspicion clings to too many shoulders and the truth remains stubbornly out of reach. I felt it that night as I sat alone in my living room, the dim lamplight turning the case papers into pale, restless ghosts. Rain pressed against the window with a steady insistence, as though urging me to surrender the day. But my thoughts were circling the same small orbit, returning always to a single phrase spoken earlier by Henley's niece. He returned the key. Not his key, the key. I had let it pass at the time, distracted by her composure, by the lingering scent of lavender in the air, by the photograph with its surgical absence. But the wrong word phrasing had taken root in me slowly, the way truth often creeps rather than strides. I repeated it to myself now, quietly, as though testing the resonance of an unfamiliar note. He returned the key. People rarely shift possessives without purpose. Lewis called, then his voice softened by distance, though not by sleep. He asked whether I had come to any conclusions. I told him no, not conclusions, only whispers. He laughed softly, saying I preferred whispers to answers. I replied that whispers tend to be truer. We spoke briefly about the administrator, his tidy panic, his shoes brushed with stone dust, the cabinet with its almost oiled lock. Lewis believed we should question him again. I said we would, but not yet. Timing matters in questioning as much as in music. After the call, I reopened my notebook. It is my habit, when a case resists resolution, to read my notes as though they were written by someone I distrust. I searched for inconsistencies, for tonal shifts, for places where the hand seems to hesitate. And there, in the entry from my first visit with my niece, I found the phrase again. She had said her uncle returned the key before he left the college, that final evening. But Henley, by all accounts, had owned his own set of archive keys for years. Archivists are granted them as a matter of practical necessity. So what key had he returned, and to whom? The more I rolled the question across my mind, the more the weight of it settled. If the key had not belonged to him, then someone else had supplied it. Someone who had access to the archives but preferred to operate from the shadows of formal authority. The administrator's face came to mind, not vividly, but with the subtlety of a recollection half-formed. His excessive politeness, the rapid shifting of his gaze toward the cabinet, the faint tremor in his composure when Lewis asked about the sealed dossier. He had not trembled when denying involvement. He had trembled when remembering something. I closed the notebook and stepped out into the rain. The night air carried the metallic tang of wet stone, the city exhaling its secrets in low, measured breaths. Tom Tower loomed in the distance, the bells silent, the windows dark. I approached the lodge quietly, as though any loud footfall might disturb the fragile architecture of my thoughts. The porter looked surprised to see me. He asked whether the hour wasn't too late. I told him some hours are better suited to the truth. He asked whether it was about Henley. I nodded. He hesitated, then said something peculiar, something I might have dismissed on any other night. He said Henley had not signed out properly on his last visit. He returned the key but didn't write the time. Returned the key. Again that curious phrasing. I asked whether he meant Henley's key. The porter corrected me. No, he said. The spare key. The one the administrator kept locked away for emergencies. I felt the shift then, a small, precise turning of gears. I asked whether the administrator had been there that evening. The porter hesitated, then admitted he had seen him earlier, lingering near the archives entrance, though he claimed it was coincidence. Coincidence in Oxford usually deserves suspicion. Back outside, I leaned against the cold stone wall and let the rain seep into my coat. My mind wandered back to the torn photograph. The pendant, the trembling fingers of the classic's Don, the political theorist tapping his coded rhythm. All misdirections, perhaps, but misdirections often reveal the hand that shapes them. The wrong word had been the bridger, single misplaced possessive that had filtered the entire narrative through a new lens. The administrator had lent Henley the key, or more likely, insisted he use it. And once Henley had discovered whatever truth lay buried within the missing pages of the dossier, he had tried to return it, perhaps figuratively, perhaps literally. People rarely kill for secrets they do not fear. Lewis found me still standing in the rain when he arrived. He asked whether I had discovered something. I told him not to discover it. Sometimes the smallest errors illuminate the darkest. Corridors? He asked what the error was. A word, I said. Only a word. He frowned, waiting for more. But I had nothing further to give him. In investigations, as in music, revelation must arrive at the right moment or not at all. We walked away together, the rain softening, the hour thinning, the city listening. And somewhere in the silence between our footsteps, I felt the case shift decisively toward its final shape. There are moments near the end of an inquiry when the truth, having circled for days like a wary bird, finally chooses a place to land. It does so quietly, without triumph, as though embarrassed by its lateness. I felt that quiet certainty in the morning. I asked Lewis to accompany me back to the administrator's office. The rain had softened into a mist that clung to the pavements, and the sky above Oxford looked pale, resigned, almost apologetic, the sort of sky that appears only when a story is preparing to close itself. We walked through the quad without speaking. I could sense Lewis's curiosity vibrating faintly beside me, though he held it in check. When we reached the door, the administrator greeted us with that same well-mannered warmth that had troubled me the first time, too polished, too measured, shaped like armor rather than courtesy. He motioned us inside, offering tea again and again, drinking none himself. I declined. My mind needed clarity, not ceremony. I told him I had only a few more questions. He smiled thinly. Bravely he would help in whatever way he could, though a flicker of apprehension crossed his features. That tremor of expression was what finally convinced me. People who fear being asked the wrong question rarely wait to hear it. I asked him when he had last seen Henley alive. He repeated the same answer he'd given before, with the same rehearsed cadence. I watched his hands, folded too neatly on the desk, fingers interlaced like a student reciting an expected line. Then I asked whether he had lent Henley a key in the days preceding his death. A pause. Not long, but long enough to let the silence thicken. He said no, of course not. Archivists were responsible for their own keys. But there it was the wrong word again. Responsible, not in possession of. Words matter, especially when a man has been lying to himself longer than he has been lying to others. Lewis shifted, sensing the tension. I said nothing yet. Instead, I reached into my coat and withdrew the small fragment of parchment we had found among Henley's papers, the lines of his poem, the faint outline of a crest. The administrator's face drained of color at the sight. I saw it then, the unraveling beginning, the quiet undoing that arrives not with an outburst, but with a sagging of the shoulders. I placed the parchment on the desk. He stared at it as if it were an old wound reopened. "Why did he return the key?" I asked, letting the question land with gentle precision. "Not accused, simply inquire." It is remarkable how often guilt will confess itself, if simply invited. He exhaled, a thin, trembling sound, and leaned back in his chair as though the weight of his memory had grown too heavy to bear. He said Henley had come to him more distressed than he had seen him in years. He had discovered something in the dossier, something the administrator had hoped would never resurface, something tied to those distant protest days, to the expelled student whose name had been half smudged in the documents. "A woman," the administrator murmured, though he seemed to address the room more than us. A student he had been involved with, foolishly, arrogantly, believing himself invulnerable. When the affair threatened to unravel his academic prospects, he had done what fearful young men often do. He concealed, redirected, invoked institutional propriety to push consequences onto her instead. She had been forced out quietly. Her reputation was bruised beyond repair. He had remained untouched, protected by stone walls and silent corridors. Henley, young then but already principled, had recorded everything in the dossier, not maliciously, but dutifully, and he had kept it all these years, waiting perhaps for a deathbed conscience or a final gesture toward truth. But his conscience had awakened too late. He had returned the borrowed key after retrieving the papers he thought he needed, papers the administrator believed permanently hidden. They had argued, not violently at first, but with that sharp, intimate fury born of long familiarity. And then came the moment the administrator could not fully articulate. He said he had only meant to stop Henley from leaving, from exposing the past in a way that would ruin him. He had seized his arm. Henley, old and unsteady, had lost his footing on the stairway. A fall, but not an accident. A fall born of fear. Lewis asked why he had tampered with the visitor log. The administrator whispered that he had panicked. "Fear is a poor craftsman," he said. I saw the truth of it in his shaking hands. He had tried to erase his presence from that night, not realizing that the real betrayal lay not in ink, but in the dust on his shoes. For a long while, no one spoke. The office felt smaller than before, suffocating almost, as though the shelves themselves leaned inward to listen. Outside, the mist blurred the outlines of the quad, softening the stones into indistinct shapes. Oxford does not weep for such confessions. It merely absorbs them into its centuries. When Lewis finally led him away, the administrator walked with a strange composure, as though relieved that the truth, having cornered him for decades, had at last stopped running. I remained in the office a moment longer, letting the silence settle. The smell of paper and old varnish pressed into the air. As I stepped back into the courtyard, the bells of Tom Tower began their slow, mournful toll. Each note hovered, drifting outward like a sigh into the damp morning. I felt no triumph, only a lingering, a keen awareness that justice, when it arrives so late, resembles regret more than resolution. And beneath the stones, where Henley had hidden his last attempt at truth, the city kept its watch as it always does, quietly, patiently, endlessly.